Welcome to one of the conversations of the Ragusa Foundation on Italian and International Culture. I'm Andrea Ciccarelli, the president of the Ragusa Foundation. And today we have here with us Professor Paolo Antonello of Cambridge University, who will speak about Paolo Pasolini, no pun intended, on the subject of Before and Beyond the Centenary, with the reference, of course, to the fact that 2022 is the centenary of Pasolini's birth. Professor Antonello is one of the most active and established scholars of 20th and 21st century Italian literature, culture, and intellectual history. He has published books and articles on the relationship between literature and science, futurism, the avant-garde in general, Italo Calvino, Italian cinema, and postmodern Italian culture. Amongst his numerous books, he has published the critically acclaimed as well as controversial, in a positive sense, in a critical sense, of course, Dimenticare Pasolini, Intellettuali e impegno nell'Italia contemporanea, published in 2012 in Milan by Mimesis, which is in good part the reason of our conversation today. 2022, as we said, marks the centenary of Pasolini's birth, and at the Ragusa Foundation, we choose to anticipate the many conferences, film festival, debates, and events that have been already advertised or will be organized, undoubtedly, about Paolo Pasolini, specifying that our idea goes before and beyond the occasion of the celebration. Pasolini is one of those Italian authors and intellectuals that can easily be defined as transnational and transcultural, way before those terms became normal in today's academic world. The purpose of this conversation is that of rethinking Pasolini's importance as an artist and intellectual, as well as that of discussing his unquestionable legacy. Pasolini died in tragic circumstances. He was assassinated, killed, and it is not our role today that of solving the mystery or choosing one solution over the other. There are some credible books and theses that point to whom or to which institutions could have benefited from his death. Our interest today focuses upon his intellectual inheritance, his own aesthetic world, and his works. Nonetheless, discussing a controversial figure like Pasolini, Marxist but not an orthodox one, and not particularly appreciated by the Italian Communist Party, not confessionally Catholic, but author of what the Vatican considered the best film on the Gospels, shy and reserved, but author of some of the most erotic or even pornographic or socially inflammatory literary and filmic works of the 20th century, and so on and so forth. Talking about Pasolini, I was saying, means to take a stance in one way or another. Because of his well-pondered contradictory position, as well as his provocative views of reality and his success as a poet, writer, film director, and public intellectual, his sudden and violent death has indeed created a cultural vacuum that many have tried to fill, imitating or following his intellectual steps, or even perpetuating, perhaps, a cultural myth that tends to justify or embrace, under the broad umbrella of Pasolinian ideas, works that he would have never approved or concepts that may not belong to Pasolini at all. In some, not differently than Dante, speaking of centenaries, Pasolini became a man for all seasons. This was perhaps inevitable, given the intellectual strength and global fame of Pasolini. With today's conversation with Professor Antonello, we will try to go over some of these artistic and intellectual issues and contradictions. Paolo, before asking you more directly the question, I need to say a few words, kind of a preliminary comment before the question. In 2012, you have published the book that I mentioned before, Dimenticare Pasolini, Intellettuali e impegno nell'Italia contemporanea, Forgetting Pasolini. The title of this book, which I believe is actually very clear, indicative of its contents and goals, could raise questions about my choice to ask you to discuss Pasolini's intellectual inheritance. On the other hand, your title and your book make me think about one of Marinetti's futurist manifestos. La Divina Commedia è un verminaio di glossatori, which does not accuse Dante, but the glossatori. Was this in part the provocative intention of your book in regard to Pasolini's legacy?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for your kind words. I mean, the presentation. I'm really happy to have a conversation on Pasolini and and his legacy, his intellectual legacies in the broad sense of the term. Yes. So first of all, I have to say that the book, Dimentica Pasolini, is not about Pasolini. In spite of its title, is about the role of intellectuals as it has been discussed and also ideologically framed in contemporary Italy. So in this context, Pasolini, as you mentioned, acts as a sort of symptom. So of course, it's not about forgetting Pasolini as a poet, as a filmmaker, as an intellectual, probably the most acute intellectual of his period. But is it, for me, it was important to understand how he has been appropriated by and used in contemporary intellectual debate in Italy as a sort of, let's say, ideological passepartout, as a sort of master key to express specific point of views, which are always partial, ideologically charged, and which also, overrides many aspects of the complexity of Pasolini's work and Pasolini's, political outlook. For instance, Pasolini was defined as a paresiastes. I mean, following Foucault's definition, meaning somebody who does not fear to suffer persecution or ostracism in the name of truth, quote unquote. I mean, Pasolini was, aware that how problematic might be to speak about truth and in the name of truth. But also, I mean, if you take many of these, political statements, they follow often a sort of, paradoxical argumentative structure, full of contradictions, which, makes the notion of paresia or truth quite problematic, quite difficult to apply. So the point was that Pasolini indeed was used as sort of as you mentioned, sort of touchstone of political and intellectual engagement, but through a sort of purification of his analysis, of his contradictory analysis. And that's why, I mean, many of these comments or these statements of his critique of contemporary society as being, appropriated both by intellectuals on the left and on the right. So somehow Pasolini, there are many intellectuals in Italy that make, those statements, those positions, those critical positions towards, as lamentations of, of contemporary states of affair. But Pasolini has a specific status. I mean, it's used as sort of a prophetic voice for the present. So for the present, which probably has to do also with this kind of a martyrological dimension of his life and above all of his death. And this has been said before, of course. I mean, Enzo Golino, also Walter Sitti, the editor, one of the editors of Pasolini's complete works in Italian for Mondadori, spoke about this, enduring myth of Pasolini as a sort of mythological kind of figure that somehow as being constantly used by contemporary critics and intellectuals. So the other thing that I was wondering, if Pasolini could really be taken as a sort of a model of political intellectual engagement in the contemporary, because some of his most lucid analysis is actually based on the type of, let's say, extreme existential expenditure, almost with self-sacrificial undertones, but also they were fueled by the kind of persecution, ostracism that he suffered throughout his life. So he's such an exceptional figure, such an exceptional intellectual, that because of these reasons, that it can be hardly taken as a model, to speak. So that was basically what I tried to argue about Pasolini, specifically in the broader context of a discussion of the role of intellectuals in contemporary Italy.
Thank you very much. Well, as you mentioned, the systems, you know very well that one of Pasolini's one of Pasolini's way to present himself, especially when he was being interviewed. I'm thinking in particular about a TV interview that didn't go, that was not really transmitted by the Italian TV at the time, right? In 1971, when he was actually shot, because Pasolini was in the moment being sued by the state for crimes against the moral for one of his movies, and it is an interview that Enzo Biaggi did. And in this interview, Pasolini claims that his artistic gaze is not naturale, is non-natural, and he explains that for natural, he means it is not secular, it is not laical, which is an interesting explanation and very clear, actually, in a sense. But he actually sees things as if they were somewhat miraculous, to the point that he has a non-confessional, and I'm actually translating into English, I'm quoting and translating into English his own words. He has a non-confessional but almost religious view of the world. Do you detect this non-naturalistic, non-rationalistic view in Pasolini's works, from his early poems in Friulano to his later cinematographic works? And how does this view relate to the rational, ideological, and aesthetic structure of Pasolini's poetics?
So yes, what we could call the sense of the sacred is actually something that runs, as you said, throughout the entire production of his work. From his first book, Poesia Casarsa, 1942, to the screenplay on St. Paul that he was working on when he died in 1975. I mean, his religiosity presents, a very complex constellation of motifs, and for quite sometimes has been quite hard to reconcile this with his Marxism. There is a very good book by Stefania Benini, who came out recently, which discusses the many aspects of this religious, let's say, perspective that is in Pasolini. It's titled Pasolini, the Sacred Flesh. What I would say is that, on the one hand, in Pasolini, there is a kind of a strong attachment to the type of, let's say, popular, non-institutional Catholicism of his childhood. I mean, the type of spontaneous spirituality without any intellectual mediation that was also shared by his mother, as he says in an interview. Also in his poetry, we find this kind of a visceral identification with the image of Christ, with the body of Christ, meaning with the suffering that is experienced by the oppressed, by the underprivileged. So there is a sort of a spontaneous evangelism in his work, and so there was also the intellectual mediation of Gramsci, in spite of what Marx claimed about religion. Gramsci saw religion as an active mode of experiencing a social and historical reality, and actually a very important element in the culture of the so-called subaltern classes. And this was, of course, extremely relevant, important for Pasolini. Then, religion and the sacred became a sort of a vessel for Pasolini to express his political outlook in terms of radical opposition to modernity, to the rationality of modernity, and to the neoliberal capitalist system. This, is particularly evident in films like Teorema or Medea, which were made in the late 1960s. Medea, for instance, is a symbol of the disruptive force of the archaic sacred, a force that indeed contrasts the instrumental rationality of the modern man. I mean, exemplified by Jason. In Teorema, we see the totally inauthentic life of a bourgeois family in Milan being destroyed by a visiting angel, which is, again, a symbol of the pre-modern sacred. So a new Dionysus, as Pasolini explains. So the irrationality of the sacred, of religion is a sort of a pre-institutionalized form, are used by Pasolini as a sort of antidote, as a sign of resistance to modernization. And they are all also, they're all framed by a sort of apocalyptic dimension. Of course, it was aware that he was idealizing religion and the sacred. He found that there was something, wrong, irrational, traditionalistic in this idea. But nonetheless, it was a form, a way for him to express a specific political point of view, and what is most important is to see how this religious dimension, the interest for the sacred fuel is originality, is the experimental elements of his work. I mean, this highly idiosyncratic form of vocabulary that we see in his film. I mean, style we find in Acatone, in the Gospel, according to Matthew, in La Ricotta, all come from this from a kind of a religious vocabulary, and the sort of antagonistic elements that he finds in the sacred.
Thank you. Thank you. And as a follow-up question, it comes to mind, Pasolini always said that he loves simple, ignorant people because they possess a grace that is inevitably lost with acculturation, we could say. He wasn't referring to the high intellectual, he was referring to an acculturation which is, the middle class acculturation, which brings us away from a certain simplicity of life. Do you think there is a relationship with this spirituality, or this interest in that spirituality, that simple Catholicism that you were talking about, that is not a theological Catholicism, and his assertion about loving the simple, ignorant people?
Yes, as I said, there has always been for Pasolini a sort of longing for a sort of primordial, we could say, a sort of original, uncorrupted form of authenticity that he saw in the mondo contadino, somehow, sort of. But it was, a form of nostalgia also for this, for a sort of mythical innocence of people outside culture and outside history. And the Italian anthropologist De Martino, Pasolini read De Martino quite well, wrote that this sacred often appears as a rejection of history. So so this relationship between the authenticity of the mythical innocence of people outside culture, or unacculturated with a specific culture of the cultura contadina, somehow is a form of hypostatization, and because somehow it denies the transformative power of history, and the fact that somehow there, of course, in modernity there has been an acceleration of this type of transformation in the form of what he defined as a sort of genocidio culturale, as a cultural genocide that in a way erased in few decades that particular archaic culture that he was really attached to, and that's why we have a sort of apocalyptic dimension in Pasolini. For Pasolini, there is a strange utopia of the past and not a utopia of the future. The future is somehow marked by a sort of dystopic, desperate image, so to speak. So,
thank you. How does this relate to one of his other favorite targets? I mean, in a sense, in fact, probably his favorite target, which is, of course, the società dei consumi, consumerism. Pasolini said in many different places, in writing, in interviews, it's implied in his fictional writing, on his movies, that he believed that what fascism and other type of dictatorship didn't achieve, the consumerism actually was achieving very quickly, and probably achieved for good. That is a complete dictatorship of the soul, he called it, una dittatura dell'anima, that would that would drag masses from one fashion product to another without any problem, through TV, through the press. And of course, we can only imagine what he would say today through the social media, obviously. It was always, there were people, even at the time, I mean, that agreed with him, but they were noticing and that he belonged to the società dei consumi. Producers had to advertise, distributors had to advertise his movies. And of course, the publishers had to advertise his novels. And so they kind of accuse him of being hypocritical about this in a few occasions, rather openly in some cases. He always replied, not refusing the accusation, it seems to me, but accepting it, but with a caveat. The caveat was, yes, but I am aware that this is not progress. Many Marxist intellectuals, and that was, I think, his target, and what made people, the other intellectuals were mostly on the left, mad at the time, because he was one of them, obviously. Most of Marxist intellectuals confuse consumerism with progresso, with progress. What do you think of this answer, Pasolini, and what do you think of this position? Is, again, a paradoxical contradictory position, but paradox is his poetics in a sense, and at the same time about his answers and what is the effect on the next generations, which is what really you worked on in a sense in your books.
Yeah, Pasolini certainly belongs to a class of intellectual and artists that express their anxiety about their contradictory position within the culture industry. Franco Fortini, Paolo Volponi, two famous example, and there is an whole debate about the relationship between letteratura industria in the 60s, and Pasolini is one of the Marx intellectuals that actually stands on what has been defined as a sort of liminal position of being critical from within the culture industry. He was aware of this, as you said, this contradiction, and particularly using media that were owned and steered by capitalistic and bourgeois forces. What he tries to do with them is try, as what he says, is to use them strategically. He says use in the word cinicamente, use cynically, so to speak. And that's why he always seeks contradiction and provocation as a strategy to have some political impact within the strictures of the media that is using. So this idea of a conflict, provocation, antagonism somehow is a strategic way for him to use, to be critical within the media sphere at that point, with the different form of engagement with different medias, being journalism, cinema, at that time, but also TV, for instance. It's interesting how he's also trying to find forms of mediation between what he calls autorità of the mass media. This kind of authoritativeness of the media, and sincerità, and sort of authenticity through some sort of open dialogue with his readers. It's the case, for instance, of the column that he had in the magazine Vie Nuove from 1960 to 1965. And for Pasolini, is kind of he writes this text as a sort of personal dialogue with his audience. So he's tried to have a sort of an immediate, unmediated type of communication that is somehow is more intimate, with a strong pedagogical dimension that was typical of Pasolini. But of course, with the film industry, there are practical elements that could not be avoided. Pasolini actually started working in cinema in the moments of its, the most successful moment in financial terms and industrial terms in post-World War II Italy, I mean, the 60s. And this actually gave him, the possibility, of making very difficult and very experimental films. Like you think about the Uccellacci Cellini, Teorema, Porcile. But also, I mean, this gave him economic stability that he never had before. So there were simple existential factors on that. So the idea of consumptions, I mean, within the parameter of the cultural industry was inevitable and somehow was, but we have to go back maybe to what he was saying, that about poetry, about art, that it's a form of consumption that is unconsumable in the technical sense of the term. I mean, it's not like a commodity; it's a different type of commodity, so to speak. Poetry will survive its author and will become infinitely unconsumable, so to speak. So also making film, writing was a way to resist the kind of hypnotic, completely mindless type of consumption that he saw in front of him during the period of the economic boom in Italy that he despised so much.
Thank you. And as we are talking about this, I mean, another target of Pasolini, of course, was television, very much connected to what we're talking about. And how, again, he was accused of being hypocritical because he was very often on TV, very often. I mean, many different programs, and of course, short documentaries. So there was, again, a contradiction, but as you said, there was a cynical approach. You needed to use what you had. But what role really has TV in his public role as an intellectual that made him really a public intellectual? Because his participation into the programs made him much more known to the broad public, because Pasolini was not a popular director. He was famous, of course, but people didn't line up to go see his movies, or read his books or his poetry in the bookstores. And contrary to other peers of his times who were much more popular as filmmakers in terms also commercially, much success, or much popular as writers, Pasolini was extremely famous, of course. But TV gave him access to people who would not read or watch his movies. How do you see, again, this contradictory stance in his poetics, in his aesthetics?
First of all, we have to say that Pasolini belongs to a generation that experienced the introduction of television as a sort of perfect storm, so to speak. It was something sudden, unexpected, something that for him radically reshaped Italian culture, but also the anthropology of Italian people, besides politics, etc. On the one hand, for these reasons, somehow he refused to engage, let's say, with a kind of a more analytical understanding of the transformation of the media sphere in those years. I mean, with the so above all the linguistic and semiotic impact that television had at that time. He said that for him, television didn't have any specific autonomous language. It's just a kind of an authoritarian instrument. a certain instrument for ideological conformity, and it should be abolished, basically. And here we could go back to the old distinction made by Umberto Eco in 1964 between apocalittici integrati, the opposite characterization of intellectual being, opposed to mass culture and to mass media, and the integrated intellectual, which works within the culture industry, serving somehow the functioning of this industry itself. So again, of course, Pasolini finds himself in this kind of a liminal position, and he adopts a sort of opportunistic attitude also with TV. So basically using TV to make his voice and his dissent heard. I mean, up to a point. So it was for him, it was a compromise that was necessary. Although he admitted that this was in contradiction with his ideological premises, but there was also a sort of urge to be heard, to be visible, to be constantly within the public debate at that, and the political debate at that time. This, disperata vitalità that he mentions was also played out through the constant use of mass media. The presence of his body and the provocation that his body, his image, his voice will bring to the public discourse. So that was clearly important to him. I mean, also from a personal as well as an ideological standpoint.
Thank you. Thank you. I fully agree with what you're saying, by the way, but I'm not making comments, not because I don't agree with you or have no idea, just because, of course, you are actually saying everything that I would love to hear, actually, in a sense. But so once again, we go back to the issue of contradiction, or a paradoxical poetics, so a poetics based on the oxymoron in Italian, of course, in Italian. Is this also the reason for which Pasolini was an easy target? This contradiction, the fact that this poetics is based on a contradictory stance. I said it before when I was introducing our conversation. Pasolini was Marxist, but he didn't love many of his peer Marxist intellectuals, and he wasn't beloved by them, vice versa. Certainly, the Communist Party didn't love him all the times, or most of the times. He was very controversial because he was a very, very reserved and shy person, but then he was accused of pornography, and he was accused of crime against the moral, and so on, pedophilia, and so on and so forth. So is this the reason? Was Pasolini looking for contradictions in life because he just couldn't do without, and therefore the essence of his poetics is contradictory because of that? And is this the reason for which it's such a scandal, in a sense?
Yeah, there are various issues at play here in what you're saying. Yes, the problem of the issue of contradiction and oppositions again goes back to idea of the sacred. He borrows the idea that from religious anthropology that explained that the sacred is defined by intrinsic contradiction, the co-presence of opposite contrasting values that he tries to bring together, but not in terms of any form of dialectics, and if it doesn't try to resolve these type of oppositions. At some point, he says that he no longer believes in dialectics or in contradiction, but in pure oppositions. Somehow he find, I mean, Franco Fortini used the notion of cineciosi to describe Pasolini's style, and actually Pasolini adopted this definition. But the term, it's a Greek term that means, literally living together in the same house. So there is a sort of composition of contrasts, of differences. For Pasolini, this type of opposition somehow was the result, and this type of, of the result of the impossibility of moving beyond this kind of the ambivalence of modernization, so to speak. There were a lot of elements that in the process of modernization that he could not reconcile. For instance, in a letter that he wrote to Italo Calvino, he says that, for instance, nowadays the bourgeoisie is way worse than 10 years ago, but also way better. It is worse because it's violent, it's vulgar, it's racist, but it's better also because it's more secularized, more open, more modern. So also it speaks about social mobility that it sees as an element of democratization of society, but also this social mobility increases, anxiety, resentment, also general sadness, and he says ugliness, particularly among the people that he loved the most, the people of the borgate. So there is a, in the historical process of modernization, there are these, let's say, contradictory, opposite values that somehow Pasolini eventually doesn't try to resolve, or doesn't try to see in a compositive, synthetic form. I think that the problem, the crux of the problem for him, which was particularly dramatic from a Marxist intellectual, was the capacity of capitalistic society, of consumer society, of let's say metabolizing, digesting its own dissent, which was then put at the service of the expansion of its ideology. So, and he progressively sees that there was no alternative space outside what he calls the entropy of bourgeois values. So, and in fact, in the famous Discorsi Radicali, the address that he was supposed to give to Congress of the Italian Radical Party, he speaks in terms of alterity rather than alternative to the current political system. So his reaction could not be but the radical rejection of the present. There was a pure opposition in that sense, and that was exactly what remains visible in Pasolini, particularly at the end of his life, and in the 70s above all.
Thank you. When Pasolini speaks about the Decameron, Decameron was shot, of course, in the early 70s, so it's the last years of his life. When he speaks about the Decameron, he often refers to it as a film allegro, a merry movie. But what he means, of course, is that is going towards a certain age, and when you get older, you have no illusions anymore, and therefore you can be happier, more più allegri, which is, of course, part of this paradox and contradiction we are talking about, because, of course, most people would say, well, if you have no illusions, you can be allegro. But actually, he sees that as a sign. And you mentioned this in one of your previous answers, and that's why I want to go back to it. Is this, and I want to go back to it in a more aesthetic sense, is this his way of telling us that, and he mentions that this is one of his apparently less ideological films, apparentemente meno ideologico. He refers about the movie, and that apparently is very strong, of course. Is this his way to suggest how we should read his works, you think, with this idea of not having illusion and therefore being happier, and at the sense, and have an idea that what it looks less charged ideologically, because it seems more that goes more towards entertainment. That's what he meant. I mean, this is more the most entertaining movie I made, probably. And but actually, because it's the most entertaining, it's also, you know, I give up all the illusions of history, of ideology, and so on and so forth.
Yes, I think it's we have also to understand that the contingency of Pasolini's statements. I mean, in a discussion in 1964, Pasolini, you know, speaks of his constant process of personal change and transformation, a process that, you know, also retrospectively takes the shape of a contradiction. So he had to reframe many of his assertions in the face of historical transformation, of political failures, but also the end of hopes, of desires, the process of aging, as you said. I mean, so yes, the Cameron, but also the three films that he made in the early 1970s, the so-called Trilogia della Vita, Trilogy of Life, the Cameron, the Canterbury Tales, and the Arabian Nights, they were meant for him to be a sort of joyful celebration of sexuality, of the spontaneity and the innocence of let's say, unalienated bodies and pleasures. So, and they were meant to be a provocative form of political resistance. So, you know, the fascination with this body was the symbol of a world that disappeared and that was repressed by consumer society. And for this reason, I mean, actually, in the introduction of the publication of the screenplays of the three films, he corrects his previous comment on the Decameron, being that, you know, a less ideological film. And he says, in fact, these films are in fact more ideological than my previous one. But also, I mean, this introduction that is, you know, titled Abiura, la Trilogia della Vita, he says that this happy moment, this happiness, was a, you know, a temporary illusion, for the reason that that I said before. I mean, basically, you know, the kind of the sexual liberation that is portrayed in these films was quickly transformed by bourgeois capitalism into, you know, a form of consumption, to a form of compulsive activity. So sexual liberation became hopeless pornographic consumption. This again, we go back to this idea of the commodification of dissent. So the capitalist machine cannibalizes its internal opposition, so to speak. So for this reason, there is this abura, the rejection of the premises that inspire the making of this trilogy. So the happiness of that moment was very short lived by Pasolini.
Thank you. One last question I wanted to ask you, which has to do with his films, is being a filmmaker. Some scholars have attempted, I mean, many actually, in a sense, have attempted to draw a trajectory of Pasolini's. I suppose most scholars, or all scholars who work on Pasolini actually want to do that, not necessarily with the same answer, obviously, but to draw a trajectory of Pasolini's artistic evolution from being a poet, of course, in dialect in Furlan, to being a fiction writer, and then while still being a poet and a fiction writer, becoming a director. Some see this as, and Pasolini was told this many times and accepted it and sometimes countered it, a trajectory that shows his search for a more popular media, of course, which is very much within the Marxist intellectual view of the time, not differently than what Manzoni did. Many scholars say Manzoni did during, of course, Manzoni was not a Marxist, but Manzoni did in the 19th century. I mean, he started like a lyric poet, and then he realized that without a novel, he wouldn't be able to communicate to as many people as he could. Or Pirandello chose theater, because theater, of course, in early 20th century was the place where, you know, you could actually change the mind of people, or you could actually project and portray certain things. And so at the same time, Pasolini though said that he actually was looking for a different code. And he saw in cinema universal language, because the image, of course, creates the illusion of realistic representation. And it is an illusion, but it's also the closest thing to a realistic representation, because you see, and you don't have to use 50 words to describe. You don't have to be Proust, as good as Proust, or as good as Manzoni or Tolstoy, to explain what you're trying to portray. So everybody can have a certain understanding of what the director is trying to say, more or less. And he mentions two aspects. He says, therefore, the movie is transcultural, transnational, and he uses this term, transnational, of course, not in the meaning that we may use it nowadays, but or partially in that meaning, transnationale, and then he says transclassista, transclassist. I mean, it goes, and this is why he fell in love with the artistic code, with the media of cinema, the medium of cinema. Do you see this as a self-explanation, a sincere self-explanation? Do you see this as just a more objective, critical explanation? Or is this really what Pasolini tried to do throughout his life with anything he did, actually? It doesn't matter if it was poetry or cinema. Trying to be transnational and transclassist, and therefore looking for that kind of code.
I don't think there was a sort of a linear trajectory in Pasolini's, work in this sense, but he speaks of his struggle with what he calls linguistic obligations of traditions and convention in poetry, particularly, but also in film. And this in contrast with his desire to be a sort of to play with forms, to be an inventor of form, which is indeed what characterized Pasolini's project as a filmmaker. Yeah, we could go back here to what you said. I mean, to his famous essay, Cinema di Poesia, the cinema of poetry. So, where indeed is explaining, is trying to argue that cinema is the written language of reality, and he forces us to broaden our notion of language. So cinema is concrete and is also irrational, and for this reason it can be poetic. So I think that particularly with cinema, with film, Pasolini could experiment with a type of language that somehow had a short history, so it was less tied to specific linguistic conventions, and therefore more vital for him. So particularly in his attempt to define, I mean, to create this idea of a cinema di poesia, cinema of poetry, that is an issue that is still discussed nowadays by filmmakers and critics. It's a kind of a long-standing legacy of his work as a filmmaker, and because of the this freedom, this sort of and this vitality, this type of unconventional approach to cinematic experimentation, and this idea of writing with reality itself, Pasolini clearly believed that cinema, I mean, his film could travel through national and linguistic barriers. And in fact, I mean, his cinema, as I said, has a quite a strong critical currency outside Italy, more than his poetry, and more that is political writing as a manifest of this of a language that is clearly transnational, has had an impact on generations of filmmakers and critics.
Yes, of course, it breaks the barrier. It breaks the linguistic barrier. Even if a movie, of course, is spoken in a language, the image, at least, break a linguistic barrier. I want to thank you very much for this conversation, Pier Paolo. I want to thank Professor Antonello for
thank you very much
in this conversation of the Ragusa Foundation.
It was my pleasure.
The pleasure was mine, and hopefully we will have you back soon talking about one of the many subjects you work on. And thank you very much.
Thank you again, Andrea. It was great. It was great.
Okay, bye.